Day, Dr. Michael Fisher. Well, yes, just take a look at this title. Um, Erich Fromm has really been on my reading list for the last little while. That's not the point of this video, and it's not the focus, but I want to introduce this focus, which is on three of my new books. I've just finished the trilogy of three books on great educators who are tackling the fear problem. Okay, well, why Fromm? Fromm has come into my reading off and on for probably 3 or 4 decades. Um, I'm not totally a Frommian. I'm not totally into humanistic psychology as he was promoting, but there's something else that Fromm was doing, just like my three books are doing, that I'm going to introduce today briefly, especially the last one, is that he was really interested in the transformation of society completely, and he was doing it as from the cultural psychoanalytic perspective. I'll say that again. He was a cultural psychiatrist, in my view. He is a psychiatrist. He was a psychoanalyst, born in 1900, Erich Fromm, and lived in Germany, but taught around the world, and is well known if you do any research on Erich Fromm. However, one of the things that most people do not know, as I did not know, is that he actually was attempting to start a revolution of hope, and the subtitle of this book, as you saw, but he deconstructs hope completely and reconstructs it under what he calls, get this, a radical humanism. Again, I am not someone typically who forefronts humanism in my philosophy and teaching. There's a lot of reasons for that. One could say, well, there's a good side to humanism and its emergence and what it's done for humanity. And one can also say it's become obsessed with itself in the worst of humanism to the point where we are anthropomorphic. We are promoting an anthropomorphism, which is all about humans and decentered and removed virtually the importance of nature, the beings greater than human. So now we have movements called post-humanism and transhumanism going even further, which is all an attempt to deconstruct and really look at this whole nature of the human relationship to the planet. And there are books even out on what would the planet Earth be like. Let's imagine it without humans. It's almost a kind of misogyny taken to the species level of hating humans and wanting them off the planet. The world would be better without it kind of thinking. So all of those are interesting and one could discuss them. That's not the point of this video. But I want to go back to at least reading 1.5 pages of Erich Fromm before I go into my books, because Erich Fromm's idea of a radical humanism really caught me as, whoa, this is very powerful, and it's not just straight up humanism. It's pretty radical in other ways, particularly the passage I'm picking, which is near the end of this book, The Revolution of Hope. It's again from 1968 when he published it. This is when the world was going through a lot of turmoil, especially with the youth revolution, right? Absolutely. The whole youth university revolution that was coming with the civil rights movement at that time in 68 and so on, brought us into the 70s. So it's coming out of the tumult of the European, whereas most of the revolution started with the youth and this uprising of class in 60s in Europe, spread into America and became the 60s, 70s hippie love movement, right? And so we all know, if you've read anything on Fromm, he's most famous for his book, The Art of Loving, and he was a big promoter of love. However, underneath the criticism, which is what I'm interested in as a critical educator and as a fearologist, and he brings in a couple two interesting words, which I'll bring out as we go through. So just to give you a feel of the kind of education I'm doing in the three books that I'm going to introduce in the latter part of this video. So he starts with talking about the importance at the end of his book, um, in this revisioning of what it means to be human, what humanity is and could be. He's not totally absolutist on this is the way it is and should be. He's not dogmatic totally in that way, but this is like a manifesto. You can't read this book, The Revolution of Hope, and not see this as a manifesto. And he is actually saying, and here are probably several stages that you need to do to reconstruct. So I'm giving all this time to it in my profession right now in this video because I'm going, wow, he was like giving us the blueprint. It's already there for this radical humanist revision of a bad humanism, to say that in another blunt way. He doesn't say it quite that way. And he's saying this is how you'll probably have to go about it. And then he puts the question mark, can we do it? Because he's not certain we can do it. But he says at least these would be the main structures. So let's get a feel for it. Erich Fromm, 1968, writing what he calls the groups, capital G. And these are radical humanist groups who have made a commitment to the movement of radical humanism. And how can we bring that actually about or not? He starts. The groups would develop a new style of life, unsentimental, realistic, honest, courageous, and active. It must be stressed that realistic unsentimentality, bordering, if you like, on cynicism, healthy doubt, needs to be united with deep faith and hope. Usually the two are disconnected. People of faith and hope are often unrealistic, and the realists have little faith or hope. We shall find out a way out of the present situation only if realism and faith become blended again as they were in some of the great teachers of humankind. And I would definitely say in the 3 books of the great teachers I'm going to review today, this is what they do bring those two together, realism and faith, if you will. Not necessarily religious faith, but could be. The members of the group would speak a new language, which expresses rather than obscures the language of a man, say human, who is the subject of their activities, not the alienated master of things, which they manage in the category of having or using. They would have a different style of consumption, not based on having and using. Not necessarily the minimum, as in a minimalist, but a meaningful consumption, one that serves the needs of life, not the needs of the producers. They would attempt to achieve personal change, becoming vulnerable, active. They would practice contemplation, meditation, the art of being quiet, undriven, and ungreedy. Calling that an art of living. In order to understand the world around them, they would try to understand the forces within themselves as well, which motivate them. Yes. They would try to transcend their ego and to be open to the world. They would try to rely on their own thinking and feeling to make their own judgments and take their chances. They would try to achieve an optimum of freedom, that is, of real independence, and give up the worship of and the fixation on idols of any kind. They would overcome the incestuous ties to the past, to where they came from, to family and land, and replace them by a loving and critical concern. They would develop the fearlessness which only deep rootedness in oneself, conviction, and a full relatedness to the world can give. One more paragraph. Whether or not there are enough people who wish to form this new group of living and are strong and serious enough to form them, I do not know. Of one thing I am sure. If such groups existed, they would exercise a considerable influence on their fellow citizens because they would demonstrate the strength and joy of people who have deep convictions without being fanatical, who are loving without being sentimental, who are imaginative without being unrealistic, who are fearless without depreciating life, who are disciplined without submission. Nice paragraph. I plucked out that reading from the Fromm book because they would develop the fearlessness, and they would be fearless without depreciating life. In other words, without having to conquer, right, in that fearless. So that turns me now to the order of the 3 books in my trilogy. So there they are. I'll get to them all each very briefly, and I'll focus on the one that just came out, which is my honoring of Sam Gillian Jr. and an American educator, African-American educator, Black educator, capital B, Black consciousness in his own way, in his particular interpretation of what it would be to be a human. And the book before that was Marianne Williamson and the Presidential Phenomenon. These are intellectual biographies, these 3, of great educators, and I believe she is a great adult educator today and has been since the early 1980s, and still is, as she ran for president of the United States and has now dropped out and will no longer run for president of the United States, I can guarantee you. As we see in unfolding, she will become a different kind of activist, political leader, etc. And then certainly the one at the beginning of this series of thinking of intellectual biographies, I always wanted to write on great educators and pick out people who I thought were really handling fear in an interesting way. And 4 Arrows kicked that off. Don Trent Jacobs, his English name, and he's a mixed blood Sioux, Logala Sioux, initiate and pipe carrier as well. And that was really his story and biography of how to handle fear and manage fear. And he was very interested in fearless engagement, as you can see in the title of the book. A quick word about these 3 as I'll now dive into the last one, the newest one is, I realize when I'm looking at them, they're all people who are people of the margins and speak from and come from a marginal perspective and come from a very oppressed perspective. So in a way, they are educators of the oppressed, but of course, they're oppressed for them is everybody else too. And so these are educators of the oppressed. So here is the indigenous perspective. And that is what this entire book looks at, even though it looks at a very diverse educator, 4 Arrows, and how he has come to put together a kind of curriculum for a new radical humanism. And it's one that definitely transcends the old humanism and the worst side of humanism. And he promotes this indigenous worldview contra the old and dominating worldview. And so an indigenous worldview perspective, the indigenous perspective happens to be a man in shape and form. So that was my first educator that I went after. And then when I went after the next, and I say went after, it's really I'm critical of their work, and I also promote it in immense ways in these books. And I'm really looking at, they are providing a new manifesto. If we were to put them all 3 together, that would be a great manifesto, I believe. An interesting one. I haven't synthesized those all 3 myself, so either you will as a reader or serious scholar, or I will continue to just put the 3 of them together and pull out, well, what is the 3 threads of all of them? And so another thread of this great educator is, again, coming from a marginalized group, which is Marianne Williamson as a Jewish woman. And that means basically coming from a tribe of people and a history of people out of Judaism. And she's not per se a practicing Judaic person. She says she holds that tradition deeply and respectfully, but she embraces many religious traditions and philosophies, etc. That's all in the book. But she is now up against, and has been up against for the last several years since running in 2020, against this particular ruler we've called Donald Trump, and what he represents as a kind of fascism growing in the world, which is fear-based, and her work is love-based. So she does talk a lot about fear and the path of how you move from a love-based to a fear-based world, and how you can re-unhook that, because that's the way Donald Trump would love things. She wants to reverse that, right? So to fear-based to a love-based world. So again, I took a person of the oppressed and the history of the oppressed and their spirit that they bring to a liberation path, as all three of these authors do. And now the last one you can see is African American. There is again the pedagogy of the oppressed, the educator who sits and works and lives in the body of the oppressed. And Gillian, Sam, he really is my first attempt to really write into and understand and be with and research in the Black culture in a full way. I've always scanned and looked at bits of the Black theology and liberation theology out of peoples of color, especially out of Latin America, but into America as well. But he was really the one I discovered through, a very quick story of discovering him on, the internet. He had published a book on the beauty of fear, and because I researched fear and search all the time to find that book and snoop through it, and whoa, this is an interesting person. I should look them up and write them a letter, which I did, and eventually got a reply from Sam. And so we communicated back and forth. He teaches in the Bronx, New York. He is now passed. So of the three authors, he's the first one that has passed away. He passed in 2016, born in 1939. Worked in the Bronx. I wrote to him. He wrote back very generously, and of course, I was asking him about his new book. I'd like to get a copy. And he says, well, let's have some conversation when you do, and that'd be interesting. So we had correspondence for 10 months. That was really the core. So this is back in, oh gosh, back in 2004. Yeah. And I kind of, we didn't agree on everything about fear. I was already on my particular fear, theorizing about fear, and was promoting fearlessness. And Sam Gillian was totally against fearlessness as a concept. So he would be against Fromm, Erich Fromm's, radical humanist manifesto group idea. Only in he would agree with much of what Erich Fromm was promoting there, but he would disagree with that one particular piece. Now again, Fromm being European, white guy, this is a Black American guy, African descent, and very, respectful of his tradition of that. But also he was he's a very universalist thinking, and he was not someone who focused on Black identity, politics, and history only. He was very much a universal, radical humanist, really. I believe that would be a very good description for Sam Gillian. I wish he was here to discuss this with me, but I think in spirit he's here listening. And so I really looked at his life as a life of courage, much like a Four Arrows, much like a Marianne Williamson, and moving towards fearlessness in his own way. These are my words. But in this book, I take a very particular perspective. So let me read the back, and that will give you a feel of the book, and then I'll just do a reading from inside the book. So just to let you know, to remind yourselves, I'm a white guy, obviously, of European descent. My interest is in universal educators, especially ones of the liberation type. I'm bringing about this trilogy of works. So when I got onto his work, I wanted to really be challenged, and I allowed myself to squeeze through these places, because him and I did not communicate for a good, 2005 to, I waited too long, and basically he died, I think, in 2020, when I finally contacted somebody, and that's a longer story of somebody contacted me and said, you know, Sam Gillian, he's related to me, etc. That led to me investigating further. Yeah, what happened to Sam? Well, I found out he had passed in 2016, and I knew he had written two books, and I have copies of both of them, but I didn't follow through with them. I didn't connect them to my work so much. They were just part of my library here, my Fear library. And I knew maybe someday I'd come back to it. Well, I did, because of this initiative of this young woman contacting me and saying, you know, he was an important relative of mine, and he was a teacher, and I wanted to get his book, and I'm curious about what you think, Dr. Fisher, and so on. So that pushed me to actually do the research, and it's a 3-year project and a bit to finally get the book out. So that's a little bit about just the brief connection I had with Sam Gillian. So it was through his wife, particularly Bernice Gillian, and other relatives that she gave me contacts for, that I was able to get the interviews I needed to fill in the blanks of his autobiographic. I also got some interesting pieces of writing from him, unpublished, and some other documents, thanks to Bernice and the collection she gave me. And of course, she told me that if you would have contacted me, you know, 2 years earlier or so, or even a year earlier, she would have had more, because she ended up throwing them all out, his documents, his collection. Not totally, but most, because he asked her to. He basically said, 5 years after I die, dear, would you, you know, you can discard all the stuff. You don't have to keep it. And that's what I missed. Darn, I would have loved to have seen everything he had, published, unpublished, and so on. So I used what I could from the fragments, as well as these two books. So The Beauty of Fear and Terrified by Education are the two titles. So you can just hear very interesting titles. And he's a thinker that challenges me all the time. So, and I got to think, that's across race lines, that's across generation lines. So he's another generation earlier than me. I'm as a boomer, and he was born in 1939, right at the beginning of the Second World War. Different trajectory, right? And coming out of poverty and Black culture in America. I have to be very humble and accepting and understanding and interpreting that work. So I have shown the work to Bernice Gillian, and she has totally basically said, yeah, this is, and they, you know, and it's part fiction, part nonfiction mostly, but the way I put them together in the basic story, she says, yeah, no, this is good. She feels this has a certain authenticity that's not too bad, you know, for a white guy, basically. I think that's what she'd say, and we'd have a good laugh together over a cup of tea, because we've had several phone calls, and they were really lovely connections. Okay, so that's a bit of background. If I read the book, you'll back cover, you'll just get that sort of total sense of the book. With current surging polarities of perspectives, dangerous culture wars, and imminent threats to the human social and ecological fabric, it is a good time to rediscover the true meaning of fear through the eyes of a creative and endearing, outrageous educator who taught, quote, "Fear is not the enemy," end quote. Through a combination of fiction and nonfiction, this book offers a first documentation of the philosophy and story of Samuel Nathan Gillian Jr., 1939 to 2006, an African-American educator activist from the Bronx, New York. Fisher takes readers on a journey of growth and development with a protagonist named Deanna, a sophomore college Black student, as she comes to understand the radical importance of her Uncle Sammy's life and work. Embellished with the intellectual rigor of a biography of a wise man, Fisher tracks his own relationship and those who knew and loved Samuel as the tension grows to a pitch in the story. Yet the real brilliance lies in the psychological, philosophical, and spiritual twists Sam Gillian brought forward in two stunning books on fear, 2002 and 2005, that this book by Fisher, who has studied fear systematically since 1989, has never met a unique thinker like Sam Gillian. Through Fisher's eyes, the special significance of Gillian's work is brought to the general and well-educated reading public. An essential book for post-secondary education on fear management, a resource guide for school teachers, parents, psychologists, policymakers, and anyone who seeks to help humanity establish a sustainable, moral, and healthy relationship with fear. So I'm just going to jump into a part of the book, and let's just see where it goes. This is just by chance. I love just opening a book and going in it. So the book's called Igniting a Fear Praxis for Teaching. Let me just explain that a little bit. That's my title. I believe that is what Gillian is attempting to do fundamentally. He is attempting to say we ought to ignite a fear praxis. Okay, that is a fear theory and practice for society, for our socialization, and particularly for our education, as he was an school educator for 30 plus years. Taught middle school and he taught adults during those years, and most of them in the central core, more poor people's core of American City, and that would be people of color, mostly Black, African American. Fear praxis would basically be a good thing. See, fear education, a good thing for Gillian, when taught in a right and good way, in a thoughtful way, in a very way that is not just trying to terrify or fearmonger. So that would be the very brief gist of his work, and he believes not doing so has led to great disasters because people are not well educated in fear, and I agree with that. I just tend to add and fearlessness, which he would not add to his theory. But in a way, he would say courage would arise out of that great and better fear education. And I don't doubt that's true too. So for teaching, I thought really this could be a book for any kind of teaching, any kind of leaders who teach and people who teach. And teachers in general, especially in the public school system, would gain great benefit from trying to understand the entanglements and the interesting philosophy of a person like Gillian. And I'll just say, informed Gillian by Ernest Becker's work on an existential philosophy, very powerful and beautiful work by Ernest Becker that Sam Gillian studied most of his life. That work, as well as right up to studying the Bible inside out and backwards, which Sam Gillian did and knew, could quote and understood. He had a Christian background, of course, but he wouldn't go around running around, I'm a Christian, I'm a Christian. He just said, I'm a member of the universe. And he was interested in the wisdom books, obviously. And then lastly, he brings in a non-dual perspective from people like who he really respected and understood. The Wisdom of Insecurity book by Alan Watts was a favorite of his in his library, as I had found out. So he integrated many ways of thinking, right from, as I say, up to the non-dual mystical traditions as well. Okay, so that gives you a bit of background. Now let's do a little bit of reading. And I'm seeing this section here. In his 2005 book, I write, he refers to his pedagogy with teenagers in the classroom as somewhat mimicking, quote, a lawyer in a court of law, end quote, his words. So you can imagine standing in front of a group of teenagers, core urban center, Black, a huge challenge. This is an educator who has taken on amazing challenge to do that for 30 years and be successful and unknown. Yeah, I have to add that. That's why the book is so important. And this is really bringing back someone who just got missed, was unknown, more or less. And he wasn't, out there trying to be the super promoter until the very last few years of his life. Okay, so although in his autobiographical essay in 1999, unpublished, which I had got an essay copy, he suggests that he was not cut out to be a lawyer because he really wanted to be, because he believed it would not have led him to, quote, really enjoying life at all, end quote. He loved joy. He loved to be happy, and he loved going into the seriousness and the tragedy of humanity as well. He was more cut out to teach youth and adults directly. Therein lay his real passionate vocation. Rather than living in a dualistical adversarialism of the law and the tedious fights in court battles day in and day out. I quote here from a conversation I had with Bernice on this. Bernice says, yes, teaching and youth were definitely his life passion and purpose. I respond, what did he think of Trump's rise and success? Bernice, Samuel was so ill by those years, he paid even less attention to the political situation nationally. Although he was not happy with Trump's aims and success, I remember Samuel shaking his head and saying, quote, I just can't understand what he is trying to do, end quote. Michael, what about his views of Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcom X? Bernice, he liked MLK, but didn't get involved in that time of civil rights much. And he also was in favor of Malcom X. At one point, we actually went to some fundraiser event for him and his work and got to meet Danny Glover and some of the others like that who hung around that movement. Cool. Michael, what about Professor Cornel West? Bernice, yeah, he liked some of West's thinking, but he became turned off somewhat as West and Travis Smiley were publicly out there dissing Barack Obama as president, 2008 plus. And Samuel didn't understand why they did do that. And so he was less of a Cornel West fan. Well, we now know, interesting passage I grabbed there, we know that Cornel West now has thrown in his hat as an independent, running for President of the United States in the 2024 election that's going on right now. Interesting that Cornel West is in there, Marianne Williamson was in there, who I had written my book on, and I'm a big fan of Cornel West on many levels, and I also critique some of his thinking and writing, particularly the way he's running his campaign in a certain way. But in the whole other sense, I'm delighted that he is someone of the oppressed, speaks for the oppressed as best he can, not for them, but with them, and tries to manifest their voice forward into a new world, a new America he obviously envisions, and like an MLK type. But Cornel West is a very different type. But they are both, quote, preachers of a particular religious Christian perspective. And good luck to the power to him. We'll see how he does in 2024 in the ballot box, but also as a teacher, an ongoing teacher. And so same with Gillian. You could see that Gillian didn't like just someone who was radical and critical of someone like a Barack Obama. And I can think into why Sam Gillian would be somewhat modified in his critique. I think he would be not so quick from the far left as Cornel West is to write off a more immediate, right, a center or even slightly conservative Black person, right, running for and becoming president. And that is Cornel West. He's definitely a leftist. If I were to ask today, in my interpretation of Sam Gillian, he would not identify as a capital L leftist. He, of course, would say, like I would, a lot of our thinking in philosophy is, in politics, is left of center for sure. However, we qualify that very deeply, and both Gillian and I would say neither left or right has it down. Cornel West might also say that, and he's trying a new kind of left. And I would say, yes, Gillian would not take that kind of strong radical position politically. So that's just to let you know, if you do read this book on Sam Gillian and his work, like if you read mine, we're not going to sit nicely and easily and comfortably within a dogmatic and or even just an ideological leftist, capital L, position. We don't think along those kind of lines fully. So we're more integral and integrationist in our views, and holistic, I would say, is another term you could use for us. And we're also more transpersonalist in our views, again, with that kind of universalist quality, even though we respect diversity, difference, and the unique and the particular of reality in people's lives and cultures. But we do not sit in those. We do not sit there and defend them and try to preserve them per se. No, so either Gillian nor myself are preservationists in that way. So we're more interested in the new creations that can be built. And that's a little bit definitely like a radical humanism of Erich Fromm. So let me read a little bit more of the book, and then I'll close the video there. Thank you for listening and hanging in on a little bit of this story. So I'm going to quote here. We all know that politicians lie, remarked Gillian. End quote. And I add, almost tongue-in-cheek, he says that. An absurd tragic comedy sits ironically festering within those words, because in democracy, we all have to, more or less, rely on politicians to represent our highest interests. But we know they can also represent our lowest ones too. Gillian, like Mahatma Gandhi, saw Western democracy as an ideal not yet tried fully, and it may never succeed to actualize. On his darker days, perhaps, he was outright and realistically quite pessimistic. He wrote, quote, Sam Gillian, educate for democracy, ? Not necessary, for democracy has never been our nation's real priority, no matter how much lip service, end quote. After nearly a whole chapter in Gillian's second book on the lies we educators tell, it's a particular section of his book, where he critiques virtually everyone in contemporary society for not really caring about children's education, he concluded his analysis of the NCLB, No Child Left Behind movement, and extended his global political indictment in characteristic Gillianism, I call, that is, non-compromising terms. Here's his summary of the whole NCLB, No Child Left Behind movement in America. Gillian says, we Americans, like other human beings around our planet, don't really care whether all children get properly educated or not. Many, many children will be left behind for the rest of this century and on into the next, as has always been the case. The children who were left behind previously we now call adults, our nation's leaders, have a history of giving lip service to the Jeffersonian ideal that educational opportunity is vital to the proper working of a democracy. End quote. Back to my text. It's too bad history did not align slightly different. Shall I digress momentarily? For I would be very curious what Samuel would have thought of Marianne Williamson. For example, in a recent interview, as Williamson was playing with throwing her hat into the 2024 presidential election campaign, she answered the interviewer who asked her about what criteria would a healthy democracy in America hold for itself if she were president. She replied, "The status of our nation's children, that is most important." End of quote. Gillian, he was typically quite sympathetic towards the authentic struggling of humans, although not most of Gillian's career was a type of soft political activism as a teacher in schools and adult education at nights. He also undertook some direct actions in his local community. He was anti-elitist, especially challenging those who abuse and corrupt their servancy as leaders, managers, and educators. But on the odd occasion in his books, he really shows his righteous anger via his critiques of the average person, too. He was referring to those who do not protest enough against these abuses of power. It angered him that passivity was rampant, and of those who have allowed themselves to become unwittingly, quote, the all too easily fooled American public, end of quote. Yet never far from his critique of the uneducated, quotes, and foolish amongst us, Gillian also says our foolishness is ubiquitous no matter how formally educated we are, quoting him. Not knowing how to fear and think properly includes just about all of us, including our elected representatives, no matter how many degrees we may have obtained. End of quote. Sam Gillian Jr., 1939 to 2016. He was an educator on fear and this fear praxis of a kind I have never read before. And his challenges to us to rethink the whole education period and the role and nature of fear in it, which he says is the most important motivational phenomenon to study and know and to bring to the front of everything we do as pedagogues, as educators, call this what you will, as liberational, as just good liberal. And he would say, and conservatives need to adopt this too. Rather than thinking we're the great heroic achievers, we'll overcome, we'll be brave, make America brave again, great again. And all of the various rhetorics, again, not just of the conservative, but liberals and even radicals that do not include a deep, deep, penetrating fear educational praxis. I agree with him on all of that. And again, I stop at some point and disagree and have a certain kind of transformation of his theory that I could take a lot further in my work and the path of fearlessness. But he was so cautious and against the idea of fearlessness because he felt it would feed and lead into, and I think he's right in cautioning, a kind of still ego, bravado. We can be great and overcome and to conquer fear. And he says it's not about conquering fear, it's about knowing fear. And from there, we will act, Gillian would say, we will act appropriately to that good knowing and reality in the terror of existence. There's his existentialist. There's his Ernest Beckerian philosophy, and then the non-dualist, and live in that insecurity of living in terror. Good terror, being good, terrified. And the wisdom of the insecurity of that, we would at least, he says, and so would Alan Watts say, and so would some other good thinkers, we would be in touch with reality. And thus I end my lecture and my review of my latest book in a very inadequate but short way. I hope you can have a look at my new book on Sam Gillian or any of the trilogy. And let's keep the conversation going. Thanks very much for joining me today.